Welcome back. What I want to do in this lecture is to look at the person of Aristotle, and in particular, his Nicomachean Ethics. For this week's reading, there was an excerpt in the textbook from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics that deals with virtue, the human good, and various other concepts related to those. So I think it's appropriate here that we delve a little deeper into Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle is one of the most famous of all ancient or classical philosophers. He's Plato's most famous student. He studied under Plato at the academy, and then for various reasons, he started his own school at the Lyceum. But Aristotle was a polymath. He wrote extensively on natural science, metaphysics, his ethics, which we're going to talk about here right now, but also on politics, rhetoric, logic, etc. When it comes to philosophy, he is clearly one of the great philosophers of all time. Um, and I think if you just look at the breadth of his studies, whether it's science, metaphysics, ethics, it should be clear how important Aristotle is in the history and development of philosophy. Aristotle's ideas would go on to influence medieval philosophy and even modern philosophy to the point where the moderns attempted to break away from the Aristotelian philosophy that had come to dominate the various universities throughout Europe. Okay, so even the moderns, starting with Descartes, look to Aristotle and or look to Aristotle as a way to break away from him to start a new philosophy. Okay, so even the moderns themselves really couldn't escape the influence of Aristotle. They had to deal with him, whether it's Descartes or Hobbes or many other of the great modern thinkers who we'll be looking at throughout this course. Okay, so let's first note here Aristotle's division of the sciences. Notice here I got it broken down into three different categories: theoretical sciences, the practical sciences, and the productive sciences. So each of these different divisions for Aristotle has different subject matters, and ultimately the end goal of these subject matters will be different depending on whether we're talking about theoretical sciences or the practical sciences or the productive. So let's take theoretical real quick. Metaphysics and logic. For Aristotle, these pursuits, metaphysics and logic, or the theoretical sciences, are pursued simply for knowledge itself. He thinks we don't study metaphysics in order to be able to produce something or to make something, or in order for it to benefit us practically in some way. Okay, we're really pursuing this knowledge for its own sake, simply to know itself. And for Aristotle, the theoretical sciences are the highest sciences because they're really not a means to an end. We pursue them for their own sake. They're also the higher sciences, he thinks, because the objects of these sciences are permanent and are not subject to change. Okay, so we'll talk more about Aristotle's metaphysics once we get to our unit on metaphysics. For now, though, just note that Aristotle distinguishes theoretical sciences from the practical sciences. And it's really the practical sciences that concern us here in this lecture. So note that Aristotle includes under the practical sciences ethics and politics. And in contrast to the theoretical sciences, the type of knowledge associated with ethics and politics can be otherwise. So knowledge of things that can be otherwise. In other words, knowledge here is directed toward action. It's directed towards something else. Knowledge just isn't pursued for its own sake like it is in the theoretical sciences. Okay, so we're going to see how this comes together as we proceed throughout this lecture. But for Aristotle, ethics is an inexact science. So let me just say that again. For Aristotle, ethics is an inexact science. And what he means by that, and he repeats this over and over throughout Book 1 of his Nicomachean Ethics, is that ethics isn't like mathematics. So in mathematics, we can achieve certainty, right? We know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Ethics, on the other hand, because it deals with the human affairs, will be more variable. And we'll see how this applies to his virtues here as we go along. But we're not going to be able to achieve the same certainty that we can in mathematics or logic when we're approaching ethics or politics. And finally, the productive sciences. Think of something like carpentry or pottery. And the end goal is really to make or to produce something. Okay, so think of the productive sciences as a trade or a skill that someone would acquire, right? How to be a good carpenter, how to be a good potter. Well, the end goal there is, in the case of carpentry, being able to build things. Or in the case of pottery, being able to make things. Okay? So when we're dealing with the ethics, which is what we're going to be dealing with here, we want to keep in mind that the knowledge associated with it is always directed toward action, right? And the object of the knowledge will not be the type of certainty that we achieve in logic or mathematics. It's common to hear Aristotle's ethics referred to as virtue ethics. And after all, it does make sense because Aristotle spends a lot of time in his ethics talking about virtue, both the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. Virtue ethics, we can say, focuses on the character of the person. In contrast to other ethical theories, such as Kant's moral theory, which is known as deontology, or John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, which is a form of consequentialism, virtue ethics is all about the character of the person. The aim of virtue ethics is not so much about rules or even consequences, as in the case of utilitarianism, but it's more about character formation. How do we develop our character so that we instinctively and naturally do the right thing in the right way at the right time and for the right reasons? Okay, so next week we'll be looking at, in greater detail, Kant's ethical theory known as deontology and Mill's utilitarianism. But the focus for today will be on virtue ethics, which is all about the character of the moral agent. And really the goal here for Aristotle and virtue ethics, broadly speaking, is to develop the type of character so that we're instinctively going to do what's right. So we don't have to, well, even give a lot of thought to what we're going to do. We're confronted with a situation, and I'm not saying we won't think about it, but we're just going to instinctively do the right thing. Okay, so really what they're getting at here is that being rather than doing is what's important. Okay, so if we develop that right character, good actions are going to flow from that character. Okay, so moral action will stem from the character of the person. So it's not so much about following a rigid set of rules or following religious commandments, for example, but it's about forming our character. Okay, so we habitually act a certain way. Okay, I think it's appropriate to quote the opening couple sentences from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And I've put it here on the screen for you, and I'll just go ahead and read it. He writes that every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action as well as choice, is held to aim at some good. Hence, people have nobly declared that the good is that at which all things aim. Okay, so let's just pause here and try to break this down, what he's getting at. Really, what he's saying is that every choice we make aims at some good. Okay, every choice, every decision, every action that we take ultimately has an end goal in mind. So this is a teleological view of ethics. A teleological view of ethics. Aristotle is concerned with action not as being right or wrong in itself, but with action as conducive to man's good. The actions that lead to the good will be considered right. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, think of it like this. If somebody asked you the question, why are you listening to this lecture? Well, you might respond by saying, I'm listening to the lecture in order that I can better understand the material, the course material. And someone could ask you another question saying, well, why do you want to understand the course material? And you could respond by saying, well, because the better I understand it, the better grade I'm going to get in the class. And if someone asked you, well, why do you want a good grade in the class? You could respond by saying, well, I need grades to earn credits. And if they asked you, why do you want credits? You could say, well, I need credits to graduate. Well, why do you want credits to graduate? Well, I need to get a good job, and I got to graduate and get a degree in order to get a good job. Well, why do you want a good job? Well, I want a good job because I want to make money, right? And a good job possibly could lead to more money. Well, why do you want more money? Well, so I can live a better lifestyle. Well, why do you want a better lifestyle? Ultimately, what Aristotle is getting at here, and I know it's a long chain reasoning there, but ultimately what he's getting at is that happiness is the end goal of our action. So even listening to this lecture here, long term, your goal in doing so is to attain that good, right? That supreme good which he identifies as happiness. All actions and choices, then, he thinks aim at some good, even just the mere action of listening to this lecture. Okay? So the good, he believes, is the end of all action. All action is directed toward the good. So the good for Aristotle is the highest end, right? It's the end that we desire for its own sake, right? We don't desire the good for any other reason. Like, I mean, you might desire a good grade in order to get credits. You desire credits in order to graduate. You desire to graduate in order to get a good job. But eventually, Aristotle thinks this type of reasoning has to come to an end. And the end will be something that is superior to all the other steps simply because we desire it for its own sake. Okay, the good is something that all of our actions are directed toward. Okay, And he goes on in book 1 in the Nicomachean Ethics to tell us that human beings generally agree that the good is happiness. Okay, so that highest goal that we're all striving for, the human good, is equivalent to happiness. So we could appropriately say that happiness is the end which we desire for its own sake. Now, here's the problem that Aristotle correctly addresses in Book 1 of his Nicomachean Ethics. The problem is human beings disagree over what constitutes happiness. Right? So if we say that happiness is the end goal of all action, the natural question would be, okay, well, what is happiness? Is there only one way to become happy? I mean, are there multiple ways that we can become happy? Is there one best life or one good life that we have to live in order to acquire happiness? Is happiness completely relative to the individual? So what makes you happy might not make me happy, and vice versa. Can human beings ever be confused about what constitutes happiness, and so on? So obviously, I mean, there's a lot of questions regarding happiness, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding the nature of happiness. So Aristotle, being a good philosopher, decides to take up this question of what is happiness. And he does so in a very methodical, very rational way. I mean, obviously, if happiness is the end goal that we're all striving for, we really need to take some time to better understand what happiness is all about. And in book 1, he talks about 3 different views of happiness. The first view is that happiness is equivalent to pleasure. And we're all familiar with people like this. People who think that the highest human good is nothing but pure pleasure. So whether it's food, drink, sex, physical pleasure, there are people, many people, who think that happiness is just pleasure. Pleasure itself, pure and simple. Well, Aristotle is very dismissive of this view. Okay, he thinks that obviously to associate happiness with nothing but pleasure would put human beings on the level of animals. Okay, it would put human beings on the level of cattle or pigs who do nothing but desire their own bodily fulfillment, whether it's food, drink, reproduction, or whatever. Aristotle is real harsh on the view that happiness is associated with pleasure. Ultimately, because he thinks it will conflict and contradict what is most noble and good about the human being itself. And we'll talk more about that here as we go. The other view that Aristotle discusses is that happiness has to do with wealth. Okay, so to achieve happiness, you have to be wealthy, right? You have to have money to spend, to buy things with. Well, there may be some truth to that, and Aristotle does agree that you do have to have a certain amount of wealth to be happy. I mean, obviously, someone living in abject poverty whose every thought was thinking about their physical survival, that person wouldn't have the leisure necessary to pursue happiness. So, I mean, some wealth is required, Aristotle thinks, in order to be happy, but wealth is not equivalent to happiness. Okay, so just because you have wealth, that doesn't mean that you're going to be happy. And if we think about it, he makes a pretty good point here, because wealth and money are normally pursued as a means to a greater end, right? People pursue money because it can buy them stuff, right? They can buy things with money. So even money itself always points beyond itself to something else, something you can buy, or something you can possess, whether it's security or maybe that new car, that new house, whatever. But money is really a means to a greater end than itself. So that doesn't quite meet the criteria that Aristotle has set out here. But what about honor? Honor is the third one. So we've had pleasure, wealth, and now honor. And these Aristotle things tend to be the most common views of how people view happiness. So what about honor? Well, what Aristotle means here by honor is political or military honor, the type of honor that we would associate with, well, maybe not our current politicians, but statesmen of the past, maybe a George Washington or an Abraham Lincoln. Like I say, probably not our current set of politicians, but that's another story. Or you could think of honor as having to do with military personnel, someone who's given their life to public service, who's served their country, who's served their community. That's what Aristotle has in mind by a life devoted to honor as being one that constitutes happiness. Well, Aristotle thinks that honor is noble and service is a good thing. But he also points out that honor itself really depends upon somebody else, right? So in order for me to receive honor, I'm dependent upon other people who recognize my greatness, right? Not that I'm great or anything, but I think you get the point. So honor itself is ultimately dependent upon somebody else, somebody to recognize who I am, what I've done, what I've accomplished in my life, in order for me um, to receive that honor and to get that award. So even honor, although it's noble and good, it's not completely self-sufficient. So it's dependent upon something other than itself in order for it really to be honor. Okay, so it doesn't quite meet that high standard that Aristotle has in mind when he's talking about happiness. Okay. So those are the three common views he takes up regarding happiness. But let's just kind of cut to the chase here. He thinks that happiness, contrary to popular views, is not an emotion, a feeling of any sort. It's not something that you have one minute, it's gone the next, or maybe you're happy one day but down the next. And that's really not what he's getting at here. What he's getting at here is the idea of human flourishing, or the idea of how to live well, how to achieve excellence as a human being. The question of happiness, we can say, really gets down to how to flourish, right? How to achieve the excellence that only a human being can achieve. And Aristotle gives a pretty famous definition of happiness, I mean, at least for Aristotle anyway. He defines happiness as an activity in accordance with virtue, both the moral and the intellectual virtues. So happiness boils down to an activity. It's an activity that's connected with virtue. So if we want to pursue happiness, which he thinks we all do, if we want to achieve happiness and flourish as a human being, we have to understand more about this concept of virtue. Okay, and in particular, the moral virtues that we're going to look at here. So that brings up the question of what is virtue? Okay, so he's telling us here that happiness is somehow connected to virtue. The next question we would want to raise is, what is virtue? And as you read for this week, a virtue is a mean, a middle ground between two extremes for Aristotle. And we'll look at the list of the moral virtues next. But before doing that, let's just back up and come up with a broad, general definition of virtue. It comes from the Greek arte, and it means the excellence of a specific type of thing that marks the peak of that thing and permits it to perform its characteristic work or task well. Okay, so that's a mouthful there. Let's try to break that down into more simple terms here. So virtue has to do with the perfection of something. And virtue doesn't just apply to human beings. So it's real common to hear not only Aristotle, but Plato and Socrates refer to the virtue of a horse, for example. And what they mean by that is the perfection or the excellence of that horse. So we could say that it's achieved virtue when it's really performing its work that it's meant to perform and doing it very well. Okay, it's almost like it's reaching that pinnacle of perfection. Okay, so we would say it's achieved its virtue. Now, obviously, not all things are going to live up to that standard. So, virtue is one of those lofty ideals, right, that not everything will measure up to. But it really gets down to the excellence of that thing. And the excellence of it enables that thing, whether it's a human being or an animal or an inanimate object, to perform its work well, right? To be able to function the way it's supposed to function, to be able to do its job well. Applied to human beings, because that's really what we're talking about here in ethics. We're not worried about the virtue of horses, but so applied to human beings, virtue, Aristotle writes, is a disposition or a character of soul whereby one performs good acts instinctively. Okay, virtue is a disposition or character of soul whereby one performs good acts or instinctively. So virtue relates to the human soul. It relates to the human person, and the human person performs their good acts habitually, instinctively. So they do what's good out of habit. They do what's good really without even thinking about it. For the video this week that we looked at, the video opens up with a person playing the piano. And the reason they put that in there, apart from the fact that it's pretty good music, is to hammer home the idea that for Aristotle, one becomes good by doing good things, or one becomes virtuous by practicing virtue. Just as you would become good playing the piano by practicing the piano, Aristotle thinks in order to become virtuous, you have to do virtuous acts. Or maybe you're a basketball player, or you're a runner. The only way that you become good at those activities is to practice, is to do it over and over, repetition, right? Doing the same workout over and over, perfecting your technique, perfecting your form. Aristotle, in his very concrete, practical way of doing ethics, really thinks that virtue is achieved and perfected the same way, by practice, by doing it over and over. So over time, one develops a character where you just instinctively do what's right. Just like the piano player isn't really thinking about, okay, what key to hit, okay, which one comes next. I mean, they've done it so much that it's automatic to them. Or think of the person playing the guitar, right? So if you've learned to play the guitar, you know it takes a lot of practice. I mean, it takes a lot of work in order to learn the different chords and how to move your fingers. But once you've learned it and you've perfected it, you really don't have to think about it. You just get on the guitar and you just start playing away. And that's what Aristotle has in mind here with virtue. That virtue would be no different than any skill or technique that you might learn. You're going to learn it and develop it by practicing it, by doing it over and over. So he thinks that virtue is something, once it's developed in the character of the person, will be performed instinctively. Okay, and when that person has achieved that state where they do the good instinctively, they've really hit that pinnacle of excellence. They've really hit that, you could say, that standard of what it is to be a human being. All right, you're performing your task well. You're doing your job well as a human being when you pursue the good and do the right actions instinctively. Okay, so what I have on the screen here is a list of the moral virtues. I know in the text it talks about a couple of these, but I wanted to give you the whole list of the moral virtues that Aristotle talks about. And he spends a good period of time, or a good length of time, in his Nicomachean Ethics going through these moral virtues and developing the ideas behind them. But we'll just take a couple of them here and see if we can get the big idea of what he's talking about with these moral virtues. Recall from the previous slide that Aristotle said that virtue is a mean between two extremes. And what he means by a mean is that it's the middle ground between two different extremes. And he thinks in order to develop virtue, virtue will be almost surrounded, right, by excess and deficiency. Okay, so you have virtue as the middle ground, and on the left side of the screen are a list of vices that represent excess, going over the top. On the right side of the screen are vices that represent a defect. So something is lacking in the characteristics on the right side of the screen. So we'll take the first one, courage. Aristotle thinks that courage is a mean between the extremes of recklessness and cowardice. Okay, so let's break that down. What does he mean? Courage, he thinks, is the proper disposition with respect to the passions of fear and confidence. The greatest object of fear, he writes, is death. Courage is the virtue that pertains to fear of death. So what does that mean? Let's illustrate it with an example here. Let's say that a person is in battle, right? They're in war. If that person were just to charge the enemy, not thinking about their own safety, their own good, or the good of their fellow soldiers, but just charge the enemy, disregarding strategy or anything like that. Aristotle doesn't think that person would be courageous. He would say that person is stupid. Okay? I mean, there's something wrong with this person. They have too much, um, they really have too much confidence, right? And they're just reckless. They charge the enemy. Well, a person who acts that way is probably going to end up dying very quickly in the battle. In contrast, the person who, when facing battle, runs away from the battle, that person, Aristotle would say, is lacking something, right? They're lacking courage, right? They're governed too much by fear. And we would call that cowardice. So cowardice would be the defect of courage. Right? It's not courage, it's lacking something. And what it's lacking is that ability to face death, or the potential death, your potential death, and not be afraid to stand and fight. Whereas the reckless person, they're just given over to excess, that they have way too much bravado, and they charge into battle and probably die a quick death. So courage is the virtue because it's the mean, it's the middle ground between these two vices. What about moderation? Number 2. Aristotle says that moderation is the virtue pertaining to the bodily pleasures. Moderation will involve the restraint of the desires with a view to our own health or good condition. Since moderation is associated with one's good condition, we can say, it leads to our bodily well-being and preservation rather than our harm and destruction. Too much would be, or excess would be, licentiousness. It would be the person who is completely given over to bodily pleasure. Someone who all they want is food, drink, and sex. That, for Aristotle, would be a vice. On the flip side, a lack of moderation would be insensibility. Someone who completely abstains from all bodily pleasures, whether food, drink, or sex. And it's interesting that the bodily pleasures aren't considered a bad to Aristotle. I mean, obviously, we need food, drink, and sex in order to survive. If it weren't for those bodily pleasures, none of us would be here. Thus, we can conclude that there's nothing in and of itself that's good or bad about the bodily pleasures, but it's how we use them. I mean, it's how we react to them. So too much wine will give one a hangover. Right? A couple glasses with your meal can actually be good for your health. But if you drink 2 bottles with your meal every night, I mean, that could cause serious health problems, if not in the short term, definitely in the long term. Okay. Number 3, liberality. Liberality is the virtue pertaining to money. Money is something that's very important, and for Aristotle, there's a virtue pertaining to it. The liberal person, or the person who is generous, we could say, with their money, Aristotle thinks that that person displays a lack of concern for their own good, and in particular, their own economic welfare. The idea behind that is that it belongs to the virtues more to act well than to fare well. And one of the great noble deeds is being able to give. The liberal person, then, we can say, is not is not a lover of money. Because obviously, if they love that money, I mean, they wouldn't give it away. But they have to have a little bit of money in order to give it away. Okay, so think of someone who's generous with their money. Okay, now the excess of that, the vice, would be um, someone prodigality, someone who is completely um, someone who just takes no care for their economic wealth whatsoever and just gives away, spends out of control everything that they got. Well, that person, or gives away everything that they got, I should say. Aristotle would say that that person is right not very smart. I mean, why would you just blow your money giving it away to whomever for whatever? Okay, that's liberality is about giving the right amount of money at the right time, in the right way, and for the right reason. It's not about just giving it to whoever asked for it for whatever reason at whatever time. On the contrary, stinginess would be the defect of liberality. So the stingy person, someone with money, but who hoards their own money, who just keeps it for themselves, who has no regard for their fellow human beings and the suffering that they could be enduring. So liberality, again, is that middle ground between the extreme of prodigality and the extreme of stinginess. 4. Magnificence. Interestingly, this virtue also pertains to money, but it pertains to money in a very specific way. And what Aristotle has in mind here is that magnificence deals with one of scale. So both the liberal person and the magnificent person act for the sake of the noble, but the magnificent man surpasses the liberal man not simply by the amount that they give. Of course, the magnificent person will give more than the liberal person, but they also differ in the aim that their giving is directed toward. So the magnificent man seeks to produce a great and a noble work. So think here of a philanthropist, possibly, who gives away millions of dollars for a great cause, to build libraries, or donates millions of dollars to pursue a scientific venture, maybe to build a museum, for example. And really, what Aristotle has in mind here is that public expenditures from the magnificent person would be devoted to sacred buildings, temples, sacrifices. Okay, so if the city of Athens wanted a new temple built, well, somebody's going to have to donate the money in order to build that. And he thinks the magnificent person is someone who will give that great sum of money, more so than the liberal person, but also because it's directed toward a greater end. I mean, it's directed toward a monument, a statue, a place of worship, a temple, something that could stand the test of time and really reflect the greatness of the person who gave that money, right, for that deed. Okay. So the excess of that, Aristotle says, is vulgarity or crassness. Okay, vulgarity or crassness. So someone who gives, and they give a lot, but they're doing it only for their own selfish reasons, right? They're very vulgar about it. Or maybe they give and it's all about them, right? It's not about the object that that the money is directed toward, or that the money is supposed to be, that the money is supposed to build, for example. So think of someone who's just vulgar, who's doing it all for show. In contrast, parsimony would be someone who, right, doesn't give anything, right, who's completely lacking in that regard. Someone who, well, isn't very forthcoming with what they have, although they could be more forthcoming. Okay, so I'm kind of running out of time here, so we're going to skip around to a couple of these real quick. We'll take number 7, gentleness. Gentleness is the virtue pertaining to anger. The gentle person, Aristotle says, is distinguished as one who wishes to be calm and not led by passion, but rather, as reason may command, he's more likely to forgive than someone who's motivated by anger or revenge. Okay, so gentleness, he thinks, is a virtue, the virtue pertaining to anger. The excess would be someone who is irascible, someone who is easily angered, who has a hot temper. So one minor thing would just set him off. That person, Aristotle would say, hasn't properly controlled their passions. Right? Anger too easily gets the better of them. Right? They don't have that virtue of gentleness. The defect would be unirascibility. Someone who never gets upset about anything. Right? And we might be aware of people like this. Aristotle thinks it's perfectly appropriate to exercise anger. But anger, as he writes, should be directed in the right way. You should get angry over the right things for the right amount of time. And someone who never gets angry whatsoever, there could be something wrong there. Right? There are things that are worth getting angry over. What about number 10? Friendliness. Friendliness. Many of us might not think of friendliness as a virtue, but Aristotle thinks that it's the virtue pertaining to human association. Okay, flattery, the excess, would be someone who will say anything to anybody just to make them happy. So they go around flattering people, right? They really don't mean what they say. Right? It's really not about friendship, but it's about making somebody feel good, flattering them. On the flip side, quarrelsomeness would be the defect. Someone who is very difficult to get along with, who's always fighting with people, who can never be friends for very long. Right? There's always tension in the room when that person is there. Okay, and we might be aware of people like this. More than likely we are. That would be a defect, Aristotle thinks. They're really lacking something. Right? They're lacking that virtue that governs human interaction and human association. Okay, so that's just a sample of the moral virtues. And real quick, just a brief couple-minute presentation of the contemplative life. Aristotle, to make a long story short, in Book 10, argues that the best way of life, the most complete way of life, will be a life that's devoted to contemplation, or theoretical study, or, not surprisingly, philosophy itself. And he gives an argument for this. He argues that the philosophic life is the most continuous, it's not interrupted, it's the most self-sufficient, so it doesn't require it being dependent on something else, the way money does, or virtue, or pleasure. Right? So if you lose pleasure, you lose money, you lose honor, um, something's going to be lacking there. Well, you can never really lose contemplation, of course, unless you lost your mind or something. But he thinks that it's the most self-sufficient. It doesn't require anything beyond itself. And most importantly, he argues that it actualizes that divine element in human nature. So there's something divine about human nature, this ability to think, the ability to question, the ability to ponder, to think about our place in the universe. For Aristotle, that represents something divine. It represents the best of human nature. So those who fully actualize that potential achieve the highest way of life for Aristotle. But he's also quick to point out that happiness will also include, apart from contemplation, the moral virtues. It will include a certain amount of leisure and even external goods. And the most important, maybe of all external goods, are friends. Aristotle says that without friends, life wouldn't be worth living. So in addition to contemplation, to theoretical study, we also need equipment, Aristotle thinks. Whether it's a little bit of money, some external goods, friendship, leisure, moral virtue, we really have to have the full package in order to achieve what he thinks is the best way of life. But most importantly, that best way of life is represented by contemplation or contemplative activity. Okay, that was a little bit longer than what I had planned. If you have any questions, let me know. You can send me an email. Continue with the reading for this week, and we'll talk soon.